I grew up reading the great futurists of the last century, Alvin Toffler, Buckminster Fuller, and Marshall McLuhan. And so for people who are more academic-oriented or of a certain age, those names resonate. So I very proudly and humbly stand on their shoulders looking into this century. Okay, so that's, and so I've always talked about Toffler because I talk about the shift age. But in the 2 years that I've come to become very good friends with Tim and sit at his feet and listen and learn, I have realized that I have to talk about something different. In 1969, Buckminster Fuller wrote a book called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And he said, we live on Spaceship Earth, but we do not have an operating manual. A couple of years later, Marshall McLuhan said, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. And then Fuller said in the early 70s, in several decades, which I translate to be right here, right now, humanity is going to be a fork in the road, utopia or oblivion. So that's the high-level metaphor for where I stand in my life today, because I've made a lot of money, made a lot of friends, spoken in all 6 continents around the world, talking about how we can create utopia in this transformative time. But I truly believe, and that's why I wrote this book with Tim, is that climate change is really oblivion. That if we don't change our consciousness, we won't have a civilization by 2100, or the civilization we have will be somewhere like the civilization around the 1700s. And I say that with full belief. So when we were working, and I went online and I found I could get thisspaceshipearth.org as a URL. That was it, because that was the whole thing. So that shaped our thinking. And so with that, I want to start this presentation with some quotes. And these are the motivational quotes. So as a old guy who was a futurist, as a young man, I had instilled in me this concept that Earth is a spaceship. This spaceship Earth. What is happening in the atmosphere today hasn't happened for 800,000 years. The reason that's significant is that we, modern humanity, have been on this planet for 200,000 years, which means that there is nothing in our playbook, nothing in our thinking, nothing even in our DNA to have us deal with what is happening, which is why nobody really has their handle on it. And people, question it. Well, obviously you're going to question something that has never existed in human history. So there's no precedence for what's occurring. So to me, as somebody who has lived this life and been of this orientation, if there's something that is totally new, that nobody has any experience about, you have to change your consciousness to be able to first to understand what it is. So change of consciousness is the first step. We live on one planet. But today, humans use the equivalent of 1.5 planets of resources to provide to support our standard of living. So in other words, it takes the Earth 18 months to regenerate what we use in 12 months. So go to the metaphor of a spaceship. Not all footprints are equal. This is a per capita footprint. So what this means is the United States consumes at the level of 5 planets. And since World War II, we've done such a great job of selling the American way of life that Europe, post-World War II, said, we want to do that too. And China, starting in the 1990s, said, oh, we want to do that too. And the issue around climate change is we're saying, oh, wait a minute, you can't do that because you're polluting. And they're saying to us, well, you sold us. This is the way to do it. We want to do it as well. Here's what I want you to understand the scale of this. 8,000 BC. So this is basically the agricultural age. It's basically all of recorded history, when all the civilizations and all the religions of the world were created. And, it's pretty much been here. The industrial age began right here, and then look what happened. The earlier stuff has come from ice core, and since the mid-50s, this has been the general source of measuring CO2. Look at that. Unprecedented. It is precedented, by the way, and when it's happened this high, there have been 5 extinctions events since the Earth began. We are creating the 6th extinction event. and most people on the planet, is CO2 is invisible. CO2 is invisible. So you don't see it. So Tim in his teaching came up with this visual, and it is now, the metrics have changed. I didn't create a new slide that you sent me last night. So what if CO2 had the visual impact of a 4-ton African elephant? By the way, we use in our book TON and TONNE. TONNE is a metric ton, which is bigger than the tons that we have, and most of the world is metric. So what if CO2 could be translated into elephants? Then the 2012, what's the number for 2015? 315. So in 2015, the CO2 emissions would be equivalent of launching 315 elephants, 4-ton elephants, per second into the air every second for an entire year. That's how much CO2 is going into the atmosphere. So this is Paris, right? Floating over our heads an ever-increasing number of for decades, generations, centuries, and millennia. Surely that would promote a more in-depth consideration. If after this morning we walked out of this hall, and there are 500 4-ton elephants floating in the air, don't you think we'd have an issue with that? But because it's invisible, can't see it, don't believe it. Seeing is believing. The Earth is 8,000 miles in diameter. So the scale about what I'm to do is not in scale. The atmosphere is 60 miles high. Now, this beautiful thing called Earth, surrounded by the atmosphere in the middle of space, is what keeps life alive on the planet. The atmosphere protects us from meteors. The atmosphere protects us from burning up from the sun. And so think about all that carbon dioxide I just talked about, and then take it a step further. So if you can't see this, it says civilization 3 miles. So almost all of civilization has lived from sea level to 3 miles, rounding up 16,000 feet. So 100%, for the most part, of humanity has lived within 3 miles of sea level. Isn't it intuitively impossible now that I've shown you just what I've shown you, not to think that these tons, 37, 38 gigatons of CO2 per year by humanity in the atmosphere is not going to affect something as thin as this? Because particulates are heavy, so they're not going to be in the outer part of the atmosphere, they're going to be in the inner part. I mean, how can that not affect what's going on the planet? The end of January every year, it's the meeting of the World Economic Forum, meaning all the central bankers, lots of heads of states, all the CEOs of the big banks around the world, wannabes, go to Davos. So these are the big global brains about economics and finance, right? Okay. And every year, they put out something called the 5 global risks in terms of likelihood, risks to the global economy, because this is an economic convention. So every year they put out 5, and they've been doing it since they began. So here's 2012, here's 2016. Now what I'm going to do is show you this slide relative to climate change. Everything in red is oriented towards climate change. So it's interesting to note that in 2012, rising greenhouse gas emissions and water supply crisis. So there were 2. 2013, rising greenhouse gas, water supply, same thing. 2014, extreme weather events, climate is weather, climate change. 2015, extreme weather events, state collapse, basically it was just this one, and interstate conflict with regional consequences. This is happening because of drought, lack of water, lack of food. So people are fighting over water now. The largest aquifer in Asia sits 50% under Pakistan and 50% under India. How's that going to work out, right? Look at 2016. So this is a month old. 2016. Large-scale involuntary migration. Okay, we have all read about the migration refugee problem from Syria, right? 1 million refugees in 2015. Our forecast is that by 2025, right around there will be 10 times that per year due to climate change. If you live in a place that's been in drought for 10 years, you leave. If you live at zero sea level, your home will be underwater. So think about that. Climate change is going to create 10 times the refugee problem that we had last year, okay? Extreme weather events. Failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. That's why I want to do this. I'm the only futurist who's out here wanting to do this. If you go back and think about where you get your climate change information, it's usually from environmental scholar, climate change scientist, or an advocacy group, but not a futurist. I mean, I'm here saying it would be a professional dereliction of duty for me as a futurist to not talk about climate change. Because that is the one thing that can really disrupt society and civilization, okay? Interstate conflict with regional consequences, mentioned that, and major natural catastrophes. You think about bad situations, it starts with forgiveness, right? You have to forgive before you can move on. So we call this book This Spaceship Earth because it is this spaceship Earth right here, right now. Here's the state of the planet. We have to forgive Henry Ford for producing cars. He didn't know he was going to cause smog in LA with millions of cars. He was producing thousands of cars. We have to forgive John D. Rockefeller for scaling up oil to power progress because he didn't know it was going to affect the polar bear's habitat. Very much more difficultly, still hard for me to do, we have to forgive ExxonMobil for knowing that they were creating climate change in the 60s and 70s and not only burying that science, but saying the opposite. We have to forgive because we can't go back. So the first thing we have to do as a species is forgive ourselves for what has happened. You have to forgive yourself for having put 16 tons of carbon into the air last year, because here's where we are. So at the end of this presentation, at the end of this book, we say, so now you know what you're going to do, right? No, the job is to end the ignorance around this, okay? So then once we forgive, we have to face forward, just like in a relationship. You've forgiven each other, now we move on with our life. So here is where we are. We have to face forward with the degraded planet we got, with all the tens of thousands of species we've already killed off, and what are we going to do, right? So TSE is the state, this spaceship Earth, we use that as an abbreviation, is the state of the planet today. We start from here and now. So none of this, in a nation that's so polarized, well, you're from the oil and you're from this, and natural gas. I mean, end that intramural conflict, and we got to unite and move forward. In 2012, I wrote a book, Entering the Shift Age, and I coined the phrase Earth Century. It's no longer an Earth Day, an Earth Month, an Earth Year, an Earth Decade. It is the Earth Century. And I wrote in 2012, and we've quoted it a lot in the book because why I rewrite it, that this is the century, the 21st century is the century where humanity has to commit to its relationship to the planet. It can either choose to live, as humanity, we can live the way we want to live and know that our grandchildren, our grandchildren for sure won't know what a beach is, right? Our grandchildren for sure won't know what a butterfly is, right? So this is, and the reason, in the research that Tim and I did, the reason we have this up here is, I used to say when I talked about climate change, say even 5 years ago, by 2100, what would happen to your mind? You'd check out, I'm not going to be alive. Now I can speak to students at Ringling who are 18 to 23, and I go, in your lifetime, this is going to be the single largest challenge, problem, issue, opportunity. It's going to shape your generation. This is the issue. This is the innovative opportunity for the millennial generation. Because coincidentally, as I'm about to show you, the warming of the planet was coincidental with the adulthood of the baby boomers, okay? So what we're saying is we have to do a radical change in consciousness in this 15-year period to even have an opportunity for the rest of the century to not go into unimaginable catastrophes and chaos. Okay? So what does this mean? We are a 730 species living in a 1230 world. Now, pause. It's okay to write a book about climate change, but you got to add to the science. And this is what Tim and I came up with. It's not parts per million. It's gigatons of resident CO2 in the atmosphere. Fact, when CO2 goes up into the atmosphere, it stays there for decades, centuries, even millennia, right? So once it goes up, it doesn't go away. It hangs there. So the aggregation, so the key metric is resident CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, here is a picture of it. Again, beginning of the industrial age. So, and pretty much this would be constant if you went back 10,000 years. A little more than 700. Pretty much stayed the same. Look what happened. It crossed 800 right around World War II. 1970 is a really interesting turning point, right? 1970 was the first Earth Day. It was the year after man first stepped foot on the moon. It was 2 years after the first picture taken from space of the Earth. And look what's happened, okay? We've gone from being a 730 species to a 1,230 species of resident gigatons in the atmosphere. And if we just followed the Paris Accord, assuming everybody did what they're supposed to do, we would go from 1,200 to 1,800. So we'd increase resident CO2 by another 600 gigatons. And look at the disruption that 400 has caused. So instead, in our book, we've come up with a suggested plan so this is the Paris Accord, and this is the Paris Plan, plus the Spaceship Earth Reduction Plan to get back down to here as soon as possible. So in 1970, 830 gigatons of resident CO2 in the environment, in the atmosphere. 2015, 1230. So that's 45 years. So the goal for our species should be to, in the next 45 years, get it back down to here, which means that instead of 350.org, the new metric that needs to be the metric that our species mobilizes around is 830 gigatons as soon as possible. What do we have to do? This is chapter 8 of the book. Chapter 8 of the book is what is we in the collective we, humanity has to do and do as soon as possible. Chapter 9 is what you individually can do, okay? So I'm just going to talk about the we right now. So we have to define sustainability as operating this spaceship Earth at 1.0 or less than 1.0. Any other definition of sustainability is a contrived, contained. Oh, this building is sustainable. Okay, but that doesn't help anything. We have to move back from a 1.5, 1.6 down to a 1.0 or less. And since we've been operating at over 1.0, since we've been consuming more resources on the spaceship than the spaceship has since 1970, logic dictates we have to go below 1.0 to catch up the deficit, right? So that's the first thing we have to do. We have to redefine sustainability to a global level. Anything less than that doesn't matter anymore. We have to decrease fossil fuel uses ASAP. That's happening. There's a convergence of trends that means it's the beginning in the fossil fuel industry. Cars, Tesla, right? No fossil fuel. The car I drive a Hyundai. I get 30 miles to the gallon in the city, right? So everything, and alternative renewable energy has come down to the same cost as fossil fuels in terms of creating electricity. Plus, we know about climate change. So all of this is impacting fossil fuels are bad. Use less of it. The autonomous car, the autonomous electric car, right? Carbon tax. Obama said, I want to put a $10 tax on a barrel of oil. He should put a $50 tax. Anybody who is against that is a climate change denier. I mean, I don't speak about politics, but it seems to me, 10 years ago, I got climate change deniers. Now the only climate change deniers that I'm aware of seem to be running for president on the Republican side. Oh, it's just bad weather, right? I mean, come on. So carbon tax, absolutely. Correlation. Cigarettes, seatbelts. People said, I don't need to wear a seatbelt. And that became the law. Cigarettes, doesn't affect me. Smoking industry says it doesn't affect me. Then it started getting taxed. There's a direct correlation, if you look at cigarettes from the 1950s to now, on the decrease of the population, adult population smokes, it's a direct correlation to the amount of tax. Completely rethink agriculture. This is what we were talking about last night. Agriculture creates more greenhouse gas emissions than all the transportation on the planet because of the way we have created industrialized agriculture. When, cow dung is methane, and it used to be, it'd be out in the fields, which would act as fertilizer to grow a menu off the ground rather than corn as far as the mile can see. So we have to rethink agriculture. Think about vertical agriculture, right? That's the next thing. Indoor agriculture, take every single vacant big box store that exists in the United States and make it hydroponic vertical agriculture. Number one, 3 crops per year. Number 2, no insecticides or pesticides because it's inside. And 3, it's close to where it's going to be consumed so you don't have the carbon of transport. You go shopping in Publix in this town, and half the stuff has been brought in from California on transport that is putting fossil fuels into the air. So rethink agriculture. A global effort to redesign and retrofit buildings. Still, if we retrofitted and redesigned buildings, we could save 25% energy. Every single building that was built in the 20th century could be retrofitted to save 25% energy. The slides I'm about to show you are about sea level rise. Okay? Where are 35 million Bangladeshis going to go in the next 20 years? Because where they live now will be underwater. Where will the population of Miami have to go by 2050? Because Miami will be underwater. In some of the extreme projections that are happening now, there will not be a Manhattan by 2060. Okay? So, we got to start thinking about that. Because if we don't start thinking about it now, it's going to happen unto us. We're near a body of water. The forecasts keep changing as we are now getting feedback. So here's the significant thing. Remember, this is an unprecedented occurrence that we have never had. Okay? So we don't know how to predict it. So the scientists are doing their best, and they do a linear projection, and then they do an arithmetic projection. But now we're getting feedback from the planet that we were wrong. What was the worst case forecast in 1990 for 2040 by the smartest climate scientists in the world is happening now. Because the feedback loop is showing us when the ice melts in the Arctic, okay, it used to be ice that reflected heat, and then it melted, so it gave more of a surface to the Earth to absorb heat, which then increased the ice melt because it was warming up more there. So we didn't factor that in. So it's starting to change. The conservative forecasts today are that there'll be a 2 to 5 foot sea level rise by 2050. And it's so out of our ability to put in our consciousness that it's being challenged, but all these other ones were challenged as well. He is saying that the upper end could well be 10 feet by 2060. If I was giving this speech on this stage in 2060, I'd be underwater, right? So if you have kids, this is important. If you're 70, it's not an issue for you personally, right? What is this? Somebody tell me what this is. Anything, anybody? Of what? Okay. Nobody else took geography? That only one guy had the right answer? Or did the rest of you sense it's a trick question, right? This is the map of the political world, right? This is Spaceship Earth. This is the map of the human concept of nation states. This doesn't have anything to do with planet Earth. This is a map of the concept of nation states. It's a human concept. When the monarch butterfly migrates from Canada down to Mexico, do you think he knows what country he's in? Right? She, I don't know. So so this is how we think of the Earth, and this is the way we need to think of it, as this spaceship Earth, as the only place we have. So for time going forward into infinity, until we can colonize Mars in a couple of centuries with any critical mass of people, what we have in the planet, on the planet, in space, and around is all we have to live with for the rest of the lives of the next 5 generations. That's why climate change has to be on top. That's why you have to have crew consciousness, right? You have to have crew consciousness.